The stage was dark for exactly 3 seconds before the lights hit. 3 seconds. Long enough for the crowd to hold its breath, long enough for a man standing in the wings to close his eyes, feel the cable weight at his hip, and think about something nobody in that arena would ever know. Then the spots opened up. The sound wall hit, and Terry Kath walked into the light like he owned every molecule of air inside the Chicago amphitheater. Which, for the next 2 hours, he did. This was 1969. Chicago Transit Authority had been a band for barely 18 months, and already the music press was running out of words. Critics who had spent years developing the vocabulary to describe rock and roll found themselves reaching for the language of architecture, of weather systems, of things that moved at a scale you felt in your sternum before you understood it in your mind. The band made records that sounded like cities, like arguments between genius people who also happened to love each other. They made rock that breathed like jazz and swung like blues and hit you like neither, because what they were doing had not existed before they started doing it. And at the center of it, always, was the quiet one. Terry Kath did not look like a revolutionary. He had a mechanic's hands and a soft, Midwestern face and a way of standing on stage that suggested he might be more comfortable sitting in someone's kitchen. He was not interested in spectacle. He was not interested in the theater of rock stardom, and in the costume changes and the choreography and the careful mythology that most musicians of his era were assembling around themselves like armor. What he was interested in, what he had always been interested in, from the time he was a teenager in the northwest side of Chicago teaching himself guitar from records and instinct, was the thing itself, the sound, the space between notes where something lived that you could not name but could absolutely feel. But here is what made the quiet one dangerous. Once he started playing, the room stopped being a room. And somewhere in the late 1960s, Jimi Hendrix noticed. The story of what Jimi Hendrix said about Terry Kath has been passed down through interviews, bandmate recollections, and the particular kind of testimony that accumulates around a man after he is gone. It, according to accounts shared by Chicago band members in various interviews over the decades, Jimi Hendrix, in conversation, called Terry Kath the best guitarist alive. Not one of the best. Not remarkable for his style or region or genre. The best. Full stop. No qualifier attached. The weight of that statement requires a moment to appreciate. Jimi Hendrix was not in the habit of distributing superlatives. He was not a man who talked casually about other guitarists as though playing the instrument were a competition he had entered. He understood better than almost anyone what the guitar was capable of, and therefore understood better than almost anyone how rare it was to encounter someone who had found their own genuine relationship with that capability. When he said something like that, it meant something precise. It meant Terry Kath had found his way to a place that very few people ever reached. But Terry Kath did not talk about what Jimi Hendrix said about him. He did not use it as a calling card or a promotional angle. It sat in the background of his story the way certain truths sit in the background of people who are too consumed by the actual work to spend much time on the record of the work. He had things he was trying to figure out. He had sounds in his head that he had not yet gotten out of his hands and into the air. That was where his attention was. What follows is the story of that attention, of where it came from and what it cost and what it produced, of how a man nobody outside of Chicago had heard of in 1967 became, within 2 years, yet the guitarist that the greatest guitarist of his generation thought was operating at a level even he found astonishing, and of how a story that should have continued for another 40 years instead ended on a January night in 1978, in a house in Woodland Hills, with a sound that was not music at all. Terry Allen Kath was born in January 1946, the second of 3 children, in a neighborhood on the northwest side of Chicago that was the kind of place where you learned early that nobody was going to hand you anything. His father worked. His mother worked. The household was not musical in any formal sense, but there was music in it, the way there is music in most working-class households of that era. Radio voices, dance records on a small turntable, the particular sonic texture of a city going about its business outside the windows. He started with drums. He was 11 or 12, and the attraction was the physicality of it, the direct translation between wanting to make a sound and making a sound. Drums were honest in that way. You hit them, they answered. But what Kath was actually listening to, underneath the drums and the radio voices and everything else, was the guitar. He was listening to the particular way a guitar could be both melody and rhythm, both soloist and foundation, both voice and instrument. He was listening, though he would not have had the language for it at the time, to the guitar's capacity for simultaneity. He picked one up. That was it. The stories from people who knew him in those early years have a consistent texture. He did not learn guitar the way most people learn guitar. He did not sit down with a method book and work through scales and chord diagrams and the patient accumulation of technique in the correct order. He listened to records obsessively, played along, and when he could not figure out how something was made, he invented an approach that produced something similar but entirely his own. By his mid-teens, he was playing in local bands. By his late teens, he was the guy other local musicians called when they needed someone who could handle the difficult material. What nobody quite knew how to describe yet was the sound. Not just his tone, though his tone was extraordinary even then. A quality of rawness and precision existing simultaneously that most guitarists spend entire careers trying to locate and most never find. The sound was something more interior than that. It was the quality of his listening. When Terry Kath played, you had the sustained impression that he was hearing things inside the music that other people were not hearing, responding to structures and tensions and possibilities that were present in the room but accessible only to him. He was working as a bass player in a band called The Missing Links when he first encountered some of the people who would become Chicago Transit Authority. The group formed properly in 1967, pulling together musicians who shared a particular conviction, that rock and roll, in its current form, was operating well below its potential, that there were things rock could do, rhythmically and harmonically and emotionally, that it had not yet done, that the genre's refusal to take itself seriously as a musical form was, at some level, a failure of nerve. The band they assembled was not a conventional rock outfit. It was a 7-piece organization that included 2 horn players and a dedicated brass arranger, a rhythm section built for complexity rather than simplicity, and 2 guitarists who approached the instrument from fundamentally different directions. What they were building, though they did not announce it this way, was a vehicle capable of containing everything any of them had ever loved about music. Terry Kath's role in that vehicle was not easy to categorize. He was the lead guitarist, technically, but lead guitarist in Chicago meant something different from what it meant in most rock bands. It did not mean he stepped forward for the flashy parts while everyone else held down the background. And it meant he was responsible for understanding the musical structure of everything happening around him at any given moment, and for finding the point of maximum contribution, which was sometimes a blazing solo, and sometimes a single sustained note held for 8 bars, and sometimes a chord voicing so specific that its removal would have caused the whole architecture to shift, imperceptibly but definitely. He played like a composer who happened to be holding a guitar. But there is something else that needs to be said about how Terry Kath played, something that existed below the technical description. He played like someone for whom the guitar was not an instrument in the conventional sense, not a tool you pick up and set down. It more like an extension of a nervous system that was permanently tuned to frequencies the rest of the world only occasionally accessed. When he performed, there was no visible gap between the musical idea and its physical execution. Other musicians, even extraordinary ones, show you the work sometimes. You can see the intention forming and then see the hands responding to the intention. With Kath, the 2 things appeared to be happening in the same instant, as though the thought and the sound were simultaneous rather than sequential. This was the quality that made people run out of words. Chicago Transit Authority released their debut record in 1969. The album was a double. This was itself a statement. We have this much to say, and we are not interested in compressing it. The music inside was unlike anything on the radio. It was rock with the formal ambitions of jazz, with arrangements that gave the horn section genuine harmonic weight rather than ornamental color, with rhythms that locked together at a level of precision that suggested hours of conversation between musicians who were also thinking carefully about music as a structural enterprise. And threaded through all of it, at every turn, was Terry Kath's guitar. Not always in front, not always visible in the way a lead guitarist's contribution is visible when you are listening for it, but essential, absolutely essential in the way certain structural elements of a building are essential even when you cannot see them from the street. Remove the guitar from the Chicago Transit Authority debut and the record does not become a slightly lesser version of itself, and it collapses into something unrecognizable. Critics who reviewed the album in 1969 reached for unusual comparisons. Some of them mentioned Hendrix. The comparison was understandable and also slightly beside the point. Yes, both guitarists operated in the psychedelic rock space, and yes, both had a relationship with feedback and extended technique that went beyond what most of their contemporaries were attempting. But the comparison was a little like noting that two architects both used concrete. The substance was less interesting than what each of them was building with it. Jimi Hendrix heard the record. What exactly happened after that is a matter of the accounts that survive, which are second-hand and were recorded years after the fact, filtered through memory and grief and the particular distortions that accompany both. What Chicago band members have said publicly in interviews spanning multiple decades is that Hendrix heard their music and sought them out, that some form of contact or encounter occurred, and that in the course of that contact Hendrix made the statement that has since become the most quoted sentence in any biographical account of Terry Kath, that Kath was the best guitarist alive, that his playing exceeded even Hendrix's own. It is worth sitting with the specific implausibility of this statement for a moment. Jimi Hendrix, in 1969, was operating at a level of public recognition and critical esteem that almost no musician had previously achieved. He had essentially reinvented the vocabulary of what the electric guitar was understood to be capable of. He had done this in public, on records that sold millions of copies, in performances that people talked about for the rest of their lives. He was not someone who needed to defer to anyone. He was not performing modesty. He was also not, by any account from people who knew him, someone given to empty compliments or social flattery. When Jimi Hendrix said something like that, he was describing something he had actually heard. What he had heard in Terry Kath was, in a sense, something he recognized. Not an imitation of himself. Not someone working in his shadow or his style, but someone who had arrived at a similar place from a completely different direction, through a completely different set of influences and instincts and discoveries. Someone who was in conversation with the same possibilities that Hendrix was in conversation with, but speaking in a different dialect. Kath's relationship with the guitar had roots in the blues, deep roots, in the particular lineage that runs through Chicago and names like Muddy Waters and Buddy Guy and the sound of the South Side clubs where electric guitar had been remade in the years after World War II. But it also had roots in jazz, in the harmonic sophistication and rhythmic intelligence of a tradition that thought about music as a living conversation rather than a performance to be executed. And it had roots in the kind of pure self-invention that happens when a teenager in a Northwest Side Chicago bedroom teaches himself to play by listening to records and following what sounds right rather than what the books say is correct. The combination produced something that had no clean precedent. But here is the thing that matters most, i.e. the thing that Jimi Hendrix almost certainly heard when he heard Terry Kath play. It was not technique in service of technique. It was not virtuosity demonstrating itself. It was a human being using an instrument to say things that could not be said any other way, and saying them with a clarity and a specificity and an emotional directness that made you feel, if you were paying attention, that you were receiving information from a frequency most of the world was not tuned to. That is what Jimi Hendrix recognized. That is what the compliment was pointing at. And in the years that followed, Terry Kath kept going deeper into it. Chicago, as the band came to be called after legal complications required them to drop the transit authority, continued to release records at a rate that now seems almost impossible to comprehend. And they were productive in the way that bands are productive when the ideas keep coming faster than the work can contain them, when every session generates new questions to pursue, and new sounds to find, and new structural problems to solve. Kath was central to all of it, not just as a performer, but as a thinker, as someone whose musical instincts helped determine the direction of the collective enterprise. But something else was happening underneath the productivity, less visible, but just as real. The years of touring were doing what years of touring do. The accumulated miles in hotel rooms and green rooms and early morning drives and late-night loadouts were a kind of tax on the body and the spirit that most musicians underestimate when they are young and overestimate when they are old enough to see what it cost. Kath had the physical endurance of someone who had grown up working with his hands and the emotional resilience of someone who had spent years playing for audiences who were not necessarily there to listen. But there are limits to resilience, and the industry had a way of finding them. He was also drinking. This is part of the historical record, documented in memoirs and interviews by people who were there and cared about him. Not noted here to pathologize or to reduce a complicated man to a single trait, but because it is true and because it mattered, because it was part of the context in which everything else was happening, part of the pressure system that was building around someone who was using alcohol to manage something that might have been better managed differently, though what that better management would have looked like in the world he was actually living in is not entirely clear. What is clear is that the music did not diminish. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact in the Terry Kath story, more remarkable even than the Hendrix testimony. The records he made in the early and middle 1970s show no signs of a man in decline. They show a musician who is continuing to develop, continuing to find new things to say, continuing to push at the edges of what he understood his instrument to be capable of. The guitar playing on those records is the playing of someone who is still deeply inside a process of discovery, still curious, still surprised by what he finds when he follows the sound to its source. Whatever was accumulating in his private life had not reached the music. Not yet. But the external landscape was changing around him in ways he could not entirely control. By the mid-1970s, the rock landscape had shifted. The ambition and formal complexity that had made Chicago Transit Authority such a revelatory proposition in 1969 were increasingly out of step with what radio was choosing to play and what audiences were choosing to consume. The band had commercial success, real success, record sales and arena audiences, and the particular kind of recognition that comes from being undeniably present in the culture for a sustained period. But the critical attention had moved elsewhere. The conversation about who was doing the important work in rock music was happening in rooms that did not include Chicago. This was not fair. It was also not surprising. The music industry has never been reliable at knowing what it has when it has it, and it has always been better at celebrating musicians retrospectively than at sustaining the attention they deserve in real time. But unfair and unsurprising does not mean painless. And there is evidence in the accounts of people who knew him that Kath felt the drift of the critical conversation, felt the way the culture's attention was moving, felt the particular loneliness of being excellent at something that the world had temporarily decided it was not interested in. He kept playing. There is a recording from this period, a live performance from somewhere in the middle years of the decade that circulates among people who care about this music. You can find it if you look. It is a recording of Terry Kath playing for an audience. And it is the recording of someone who has been doing this long enough that the performance has been stripped of anything performative, anything designed to create an impression. What remains is just the thing itself, the guitar and the air and the man's relationship with both. It sounds like nothing else. The questions he was pursuing with the instrument by the late 1970s were increasingly interior ones, less concerned with what the guitar could do in dialogue with the horn section and the rhythm section and the complex arrangements that Chicago had built its reputation on, and more concerned with what the guitar could do alone, what it could say when stripped of context, when reduced to the most fundamental conversation between a human hand and 6 strings and the physical properties of amplified sound. He had ideas for a solo record. This is documented. He had sounds in his head that had not yet made it into the band's context, textures and structures that required a different kind of space to develop properly. Whether that record would have been what he was imagining, whether the sounds in his head would have translated into the sounds on tape, is one of the unanswerable questions that always surround a life that ended before the work was done. But the work was not done. He knew that. He was 31 years old and still in the middle of figuring out what he wanted to say. January 23, 1978. Woodland Hills, California. A party at the home of a roadie named Don Johnson. This is the historical record, assembled from accounts given in the aftermath and verified in multiple biographies and band member memoirs. Kath had been there through the night. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, in a moment that most accounts describe as casual, almost offhand, he picked up a gun. What followed was an accident, unintentional, the result of a man who had been drinking making a mistake that could not be undone. He died that morning. He was 31 years old. The members of Chicago heard the news in the hours that followed, each of them in their own separate place, each of them receiving it in the particular privacy of early morning. What they experienced in those hours is theirs, not available for reconstruction or dramatization. What is available is what they have chosen to say publicly in the years since, and what they have said, consistently and with the kind of directness that comes from grief that has had decades to metabolize, is that they lost something that day that could not be replaced. Not because no guitarist is as technically accomplished as Kath was, though the argument could be made, but because the specific thing that Kath brought to the music, the particular quality of his listening and his thinking and his relationship with sound, was entirely his own. It could not be inherited or approximated or carried forward by someone else. It ended on January 23, 1978. The day after the news broke, Jimi Hendrix had already been dead for 7.5 years. He had died in September 1970, before his 28th birthday, before the full implications of what he had started could be worked out by anyone, including himself. He never got to hear where Terry Kath went in the 1970s. He never got to hear the solo experiments Kath was planning, and the sounds he was trying to find, the directions he was trying to move in. The conversation between 2 men who had recognized each other across the distance of their different approaches to the same instrument never had the chance to develop into what it might have been. What remains is the music, and the statement, and the question that the statement opens up, which is this: what does it mean for the greatest guitarist of a generation to point at someone and say, "That person is better than I am"? It does not mean what most people assume it means, which is a ranking, a hierarchy, a definitive answer to the question of who was best at the thing. Jimi Hendrix was not interested in ranking. He was interested in music. What he was pointing at when he made that statement was not a competition result but a quality he had encountered that astonished him, a quality of natural musical intelligence operating at a level that even his own extraordinary natural musical intelligence recognized as rare. He was pointing at something specific, the experience of hearing someone play and understanding, with the part of you that has spent your entire life listening to music, that this person has a relationship with sound that goes somewhere most people cannot follow, somewhere below the level of technique, somewhere below even the level of artistry in its conventional sense, somewhere in the vicinity of what music actually is, which is not a collection of notes arranged according to rules, but a living thing, incapable of carrying information that words cannot carry and images cannot carry, and that only arrives, if it arrives at all, through the specific medium of organized sound made by someone who knows where to look for it. Terry Kath knew where to look for it. He found things there that nobody else found. He made records that documented those findings. He played on stages and in studios for 11 years and left behind a body of work that, if you listen to it with the attention it deserves, will tell you things about what the guitar is capable of that you did not know before you started listening. He is not as famous as he should be. This is partly the accident of timing, the way his band's commercial success in the later 1970s overshadowed the earlier, more radical work. Partly the accident of genre, the way jazz rock and horn-driven rock occupy an uncomfortable middle space in the narrative that rock history has constructed for itself, too structured for the people who love raw rock, too electric for the people who love jazz. Partly the accident of his own temperament, his resistance to the mythology building that most musicians of his era engaged in as part of the professional requirement of being a rock star. The musicians who played with Terry Kath have spent the decades since his death trying to describe what he was. They return to the same inadequate language because adequate language does not exist. They say he was the real thing. They say the guitar was part of him in a way that was different from how the guitar is part of most guitarists. Yet they say that being in the room when he played was a different experience from being in the room when almost anyone else played. Jimi Hendrix said it more simply, and said it first, and said it in a way that cuts through all the inadequacy of the language and points directly at the thing, that Terry Kath was the best guitarist alive. What would you sacrifice for one perfect sound? Terry Kath answered that question every time he picked up a guitar. He just never stopped to explain the answer in words. He left that part to the music. The records remain. The testimony remains. And somewhere in the gap between what Jimi Hendrix heard and what he could not find the words to fully describe, the truth of Terry Kath remains, waiting for enough silence to become audible again.